So welcome again. My name is Christiane Hardy. I have been at Dartmouth for over 20 years. I started my Dartmouth career here at the Dickey Center for International Understanding. I have served 2 tours of duty as the interim director of the Dickey Center, ending most recently on August 31st of this year, when we welcomed in our terrific new director, Victoria Holt. I want to welcome the members of the class of 1957, of 1982, and our first-year students in the Great Issues Scholars Program who have joined us today here in the room, but also a warm welcome to everyone who is streaming this event from their home. We're delighted to have you here, and you're with us for Homecoming in Spirit. Thanks again for joining us. This afternoon, we're going to talk a little bit about the legacy of John Sloan Dickey, who was president at the college from 1945 to 1970. And we'll talk about his impact on Dartmouth and on her students. I'm pleased to welcome 4 panelists who are going to offer different perspectives on that legacy of the man. And kicking us off today is going to be Professor Emeritus of History, Jerry Daniel, who also happens to be a member of the class of 1955 and was himself a student of John Sloan Dickey. I'll introduce each of the panelists in turn, and then I'll invite Professor Daniel to kick us off with his remarks. Professor Daniel taught courses here at Dartmouth on colonial America, the American Revolution, the history of New England, and has served as Dartmouth's unofficial historian for many, many years. He continues to lecture regularly on many topics. My personal favorite of his writings is his short history on Eleazar Wheelock and the Dartmouth Charter. You can read this fascinating history of the individual who gave birth to this institution in the Dartmouth Alumni Magazine. The back issues are available online, and this is an issue from 1969. I've asked Professor Daniel to speak about John Sloan Dickey as president of Dartmouth and his impact on the institution, though I suspect he might have some personal remembrances of him as his president. We're then going to hear from a few members of the class of 1957. Gene Booth will be joining us remotely, and you can see his lovely face on screen. He was formerly the director of the Rhode Island Commission of Human Rights and now runs MLK Business Forums, an organization that encourages large corporations to do business with minority-owned firms. At Dartmouth, Gene played guard on our basketball team and in 2006 was inducted into the Northeast Basketball Hall of Fame. Gene will be followed by his classmate, Charles Takaris, founding partner of CBT, Childs Berman and Tascaris Inc., a 250-person design firm specializing in architectural, urban, and interior design. Charles was a Fulbright Scholar to Italy in 1963 and has served on the New England Fulbright Board of Directors. I've asked Gene and Charles to speak to their experience as being students under Dickey's presidency. Next, we'll hear from Melissa Cook, class of 1982. Melissa is the founder and managing director of American Sunrise Partners, LLC. African Sunrise Partners, LLC. I don't know about y'all, but speaking with a mask has been a bit of a challenge for me. I think it addles the brain as much as it does mangle the speech. She served as an equity analyst for a number of Wall Street firms before founding a firm offering research and advising services to institutions and companies investing and doing business in Africa. In 2014, she was appointed to a 2-year term on Obama's Advisory Council on Doing Business in Africa. Melissa will speak to Dickey's influence on the Dartmouth she experienced after his presidency, but before the founding of the center that bears his name. Each panelist has been asked to speak for about 8 to 10 minutes. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you, Professor Daniel.
Okay, I should warn you, this is the first time I've spoken with the mask on my face. Can you hear me all right? Yes. Okay. I'm going to take 2 events in Dickey's life, 2 things that seems to me very helpful to understand in context and then how they've resonated through the history of the college since then. The first is his response to the formation of the Ivy League. That was formally consummated in 1955. When Dickey retired, and before he had his debilitating stroke a few years afterwards, was hired to do an oral history with him. And we went on for 2 years, and we have 50 hours of tape chronicling his life. So discussing, of all those 50 hours, the one subject I remember the most about is his discussion, which was based on a single sentence. If we're going to compete with them athletically, we're going to compete with them academically, but only at the undergraduate level. He was halfway through his presidency, and the rest of his presidency, I'm sure a lot of his thinking as the negotiations went on to the formation of the Ivy League were how that would impact the institution. It impacted it in several ways. First place, Dartmouth had 3 strange corporate companions: a medical school, an engineering school, and a business school. And they didn't take undergraduates. What are you going to do? Well, the first thing that happened was they explored the possibility of closing the medical school and decided against it. They couldn't very well close Tuck School. It was too tied to President Tucker. And the third one, the engineering school, had almost been closed in the 30s, but as Dartmouth got turned over to the military, the Navy, during World War II, 90% of the student body some of the time were military. It had developed the internal strength to be something. I have 2 older brothers who were graduates of Thayer School. What he did was to continue to insist that these weren't part of Dartmouth. They were called associated schools, and that's the language. They were not allowed to raise money. They were given a modest $150,000 a year, I think it was, subvention, okay? And they basically were not obviously covered in the commitment to improve, professionalize the undergraduate education. The concrete thing that, and in terms of just that component of what they did, was in a sense what he didn't do, namely he didn't pay much attention to those schools, was the fact that at one point in time, a group of microbiologists, I'm not even sure I got the right term there, got a grant from NIH, National Institute of Health. It was a huge grant. Translated into dollars we got today, it'd be close to $1 billion. Dickey turned it down. He said, there is no way we're going to spend our money as you have to in one of these kind of arrangements where they pay it all in the first year, and 50% in the second year, and by the 3rd year or 4th year, the institution is paying it all. Meanwhile, the decision to place an emphasis upon undergraduate education affected both faculty and students. The students, they began to be more competitive. They had to take the SATs. They basically were made stiffer academic obligations. Students also were, in a sense, rewarded by a very powerful student government. I was the head of the judicial committee that handled all discipline except academic discipline. No lawyers around, no deans around. Convinced me I didn't want to be a lawyer, but that's another matter. Powerful student government. The faculty got affected in several ways. Faculty had more demands in terms of professional standing. So you began to have a scholarly requirement to get tenure, which is this prize you get in the academic world if you perform well for 6 years, and then you get a job for life. And what had happened was there was a real tension between the potential of the post-undergraduate activities and the commitment to undergraduate education, which came to a crunch time in which the faculty formed a committee that was going to be the graduate committee, and it was going to establish policy concerning post-undergraduate education. And that committee, Frank Smallwood, I don't know if any of you remember him in the government department, was on the committee. He basically was against the government department, many of whom wanted to go have a graduate program, and got kind of trapped between his position on the committee because when he was opposed to it. So somebody arranged for him to resign from the committee and have me take his place. And what we ended up doing is recommending the following, which really dictated the relationship between undergraduate and non-undergraduate education for almost all of the rest of the century, and in many ways beyond that. And this is a real important Dickey legacy. It had 3 components. First, decision to have a graduate program lay with departments, not with the administration. Secondly, post-undergraduate students would never exceed 10% of the undergraduates. And the critical one, no graduate student may teach a course. You could give lectures, but it's not like what happened. I was at Harvard Graduate School. I taught. A big fancy professor come in, 400 people in the class, and none of the students in the class ever saw him. It was only the graduate students who did the teaching. And that ended up in kind of an institutional compromise which almost continues to exist today. Of course, our reason for being here is to link Dickey's presidency to the present. One of my favorite artifacts I brought along, I played, Gene will appreciate this, I was the manager of basketball. I played on the faculty basketball team, and we voted to have our church, this is a little worn, say teacher on the front and scholar on the back. I'm not quite sure why I saved it, but that was a conscious decision to reflect the reply. And so a teacher scholar is just part of the language and remains so too, rather than scholar teacher. Okay, so Dickey died, very unhappy last several years when the student rebellion destroyed the student government he had, but Dartmouth survived okay. Dartmouth is going through today, and this is the last part of my talk, today the most important change, I think, since the formation of the Ivy League. And it's a product basically of technology, the changing pattern of preferences of students, the attraction to what we know, and you're all familiar with the term STEM, science, technology, engineering or environment, some people put the other in, and mathematics. If you get a chance while you're here, go down the road toward the Ledyard Bridge. There's a new traffic light there, and turn right if you're going down, and you can go up to what is being built as the West Campus. And it's doubling the size of the Thayer School. There's the computer science is moving down there. There's a huge building funded by the oil company and energy institute from Canada. And it sort of matches what had happened earlier, the medical school combining with the hospital and the clinic to provide what's become the most important medical center in New England, north of Boston and Hartford, Connecticut. And so you've got over there a medical campus, you've got down there the West End. It's on the end of Tuck Drive. You can't get on Tuck Drive, you can't get through at that point now. And what has happened is there is now a graduate school, but it's relatively small, and it's combining, or for management purposes, the graduate programs that departments have chosen to have. But what is really happening in terms of the institution is the creation, and this is my last thing I'll be saying, of a package of things called either centers or institutes. Their purpose is to provide preparation for committing world-solving professional activity in a way in which undergraduates and post-undergraduates both have access. Right now, undergraduates on a competitive basis can take some courses in Tuck School. Engineering always was a model of combining undergraduate, because you can major in engineering. The last one, the best publication I've seen of it is a listing of it, and I'm going to end by just reading off what the names of these are that are energizing the institution in a pragmatic way for modern terms. And John Dickey always used to say, you know, the world's problems are your problems. And this one is by a good friend of mine, used to be president, Jim Wright. It's called the Susan and James Wright Center for the Study of Computation and Just Communities. And there are several that have been founded. The first to be founded was the John Sloan Dickey Center for International Understanding. One of the ones that I find very active is what we call an entrepreneurial institute, in which people, I just noticed that somebody sold a company that started, sponsored in part by this entrepreneurial institute, for $175 million. I assume Dartmouth got a cut, but the three people, founders, were a professor at the Thayer School, somebody who I couldn't figure out what his identification was, and a postdoc. And the one project I was involved with, not just on the edge, was led by undergraduates. And much of the faculties in these are hired not because they're going to be part of, say, a graduate school, that would be it, but they are going to be basically available to have their time distributed among where within this institution. And my last observation is just simply that the promotion of this is a list of them all. This is a fundraising gimmick, it was, and about 12 of them altogether. Is the language that Phil, as our current president, introduced it with, were based upon the legacy that Dickey provided through both great issues and through the world's problems are your problems. And that's the end of my talk.
Thank you, Professor Danielle. fascinating trajectory of the history. Let's turn it over now to Jean Booth, who is on our screen. Jean, can you give us some reflections on your time as a student here when Dickey was president?
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. First of all, Chris, I don't think I want to thank you for putting me on after Jared Daniel. I've known Jared for longer than he wants to admit. But the last time I spoke at Dartmouth, I was invited up by Jim Breeden, class of 50, I think, 6. He was the dean of the Tupper Foundation at the time, and he needed an alumnus to speak at an anti-apartheid conference that he was convening for Northern New England. So he invited me because everyone else defected. So he asked me, where do I want to go on the agenda? And on the agenda, he had Mel King, a legend in the Boston area, a giant African-American community activist and politician. He ran for mayor many years ago. And then he also had an African poet by the name of Dennis Brutus. He had been in that wonderful prison in South Africa and knew Mandela very well. So I said, well, look, put me on first. There's no way I'm going to follow Dennis Brutus and Mel King. And Chris, thank you for putting me on after Jared Daniel. And if you had asked me, I would have told you to put me on last. I don't want to go behind these giants before you. Anyway, let me begin, because you've asked me to not exceed 10 minutes and try to keep it to 8. I'll try to do better than
It's now to
that.
6 now.
Okay. But anyway, let me begin by saying to you, before I talk about President Dickey and his legacy, why did I come or go to Dartmouth? Why Dartmouth? Well, I grew up in New Jersey, the son of hardworking parents, the last of 4 brothers, and I was a fairly good student, a very popular gentleman. I grew up in a town of about 12,000 people, Red Bank, New Jersey, Count Basie's hometown for you jazz fans. In any event, I was a pretty good country boy basketball player. Jerry can attest to that. And I was doing very well my senior year, and the newspapers were saying, where are you going to go to college? Well, I hadn't even thought about college, although it was pretty much mandated by my hardworking parents that I would be going to college, as my other brothers did. But in any event, I was introduced by my oldest brother to a gentleman who had graduated Dartmouth, and he came over to the house and watched me play, and he said, you're pretty good, you could play now. And then he listened to some of my records. It was then rhythm and blues and calypso, and he knew all of this. This was a white gentleman. He knew all of the songs. He was getting down like he was a brother. So I said, this guy's pretty cool. You look into this Dartmouth stuff. The only thing I knew about Dartmouth is that they lost to football in Columbia every year. In any event, I started telling newspaper people that I was thinking of going to Dartmouth. And the alumni in the area got excited about that. There was one alumnus, he was a class of 46. He had been a basketball player at Dartmouth. His father had been a coach of the rival team in our area. He came to one of my games and he said, you could start for that school right now. And, you know, I was 16, 17 years old. That really plucked me out. I thought, hey, I'm great. And he said, if you can get in, you should go there because they have a fantastic coach coming in by the name of Doggy Julian. He had coached the Celtics at Holy Cross. So I said, well, maybe I'll go there if I can get in. Over the year, every camp kept saying, if you can get in. Two other schools recruited me in the area, Lafayette University and Fordham. And they both said they would give me a scholarship if I didn't get into Dartmouth, come to their school. They said, but if you get into Dartmouth, you should go there because this Julian guy is really a principal coach. So that's how I ended up at Dartmouth. Long story short, in any event, John Doe Slick Dickey impresses me by legacy with one speech he gave to us. Every year we would get an introductory speech from the president. In this particular speech, he said, we are interested in developing well-rounded men. He said, by that, we mean you should be versed in many areas, but we're not interested in developing any cue balls. We don't want you to be so well-rounded that you forsake excellence in every area. That stuck with me for a long time. I was not an outstanding student. Certainly in high school, I was better than average. For a high school, I was not that competitive. But at Dartmouth, I was your solid gentleman C. The only reason I graduated is because after dropping out of pre-med, I developed into a sociology major, and I knew how to take the solid, easy academic courses to make sure I graduated. After getting rid of chemistry 3, math 3, trigonometry, courses that were foreign to me, I settled in to become a solid gentleman C. And one of the proudest moments of my life is when I got the Dartmouth diploma. But I did develop what John Sloan Dickey encouraged, and that was to be well-versed in many areas. One of the things I learned from college was taught to me by Coach Doggy Julian. Coach Julian counseled me after I had a real horrible year academically. And he said, you know, you can do this work. All you have to do is stick to it and make believe it's a basketball game. And he said, let me tell you another thing. 80% of your education is association. Those words stuck with me like glue. At first I thought I didn't know what was going on because I was hanging out with basketball players, people on his team. So what was wrong with that? What he was saying is be careful who you hang out with, because in the end, that's who's gonna help you get over. Today, I know what he was talking about. He was talking about the associates that I had in my fraternity. I had at the Sphinx Corporation, that I had in other classes. I had like Charlie on the panel, Sakaris, and I've known Jared Daniel since 1953. And it's just been a wonderful experience that John Sloan Dickey encouraged the development of gentlemen, unfortunately only gentlemen in those days, that were well versed in a lot of areas and were able to communicate across all lines. Now, let me explain to you why I think the legacy of Dickie is really important. We had a class called Great Issues. One of the reasons they invited me is because during Great Issues, many great renowned speakers were brought up to speak to us. One was the late Justice Thurgood Marshall.
Yeah.
In our class, I was told that he spoke to our Great Issues class senior year. Well, I don't remember that.
You don't?
In our class, there were 4 of us. 2 others are still alive.
Yeah.
Warner Trainum and Garvey Clark. Neither of them remember him speaking to our class. I remember hearing him when he spoke to the junior class, class of 56. Someone invited me to hear that speech and also invited me to meet with him after he spoke with a smaller group of us in a room not unlike this in the basement of Dartmouth Hall. That was an amazing meeting. He talked to us like he was one of us. He talked to us like he knew about being a Black person in this society and being one of a few. And that impressed me because he could talk to the great young students in a very white Dartmouth class as though he was one of them. And then he could meet with us after and talk to us like he was one of us. So that taught me that you had to do the well-rounded thing that John Sloan Dickey was trying to instill in us. That encouraged me to follow Justice Marshall very carefully. One of the things that I want to talk to you about is President James O. Friedman put out a book, I don't know if you can see this, of speeches when he was president. And one of them was Thurgood Marshall, man of character. And President Friedman quoted a speech from Justice Marshall. And I'll read you part of it. Justice Marshall said, "I wish I could say that racism and prejudice were only distant memories and that liberty and equality were just around the bend. I wish I could say that America has come to appreciate diversity and to see and accept similarity. But as I look around, I see not a nation of unity, but of division. Afro and white, indigenous and immigrant, rich and poor, educated and illiterate, even many educated whites and successful Negroes have given up on integration and lost hope in equality." He went on to say, "We cannot play ostrich. Democracy cannot flourish amid fear, rage, and we must go against the prevailing wind. Justice cannot take root amid rage. We must go against the prevailing wind. We must dissent from the indifference. We must dissent from apathy. We must dissent from fear, the hatred, and the mistrust. We must dissent from a government that has left young without jobs, education, or hope. We must dissent from the poverty of vision and the absence of moral leadership. We must dissent because America can do better, because America has no choice but to do better. That was the end of his fantastic speech. Now that, to me, exemplifies the legacy that comes from the president of John Sloan Dickey and has been passed down through the ages. And I encourage all of us in this room to reflect very carefully on those fine words, because I want to end by quoting another favorite of mine, Dr. Maya Angelou, who said in an excerpt of her great poem, I got a copy of it here somewhere. I made a secretary on that's what happens when you retire, on the pulse of morning. And one line goes, history, despite its wretched pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, need not be lived again. I'll end with that, and I would encourage each of us, panelists, participants, current students, future students, old-time students like Jerry, Charlie, and myself. Melissa, you're still a young one. Make sure we try to follow those sage words, because I know we can do better, and we can begin at home right here at the Dickey Center. We can start to look at ourselves and become more diverse than you are right now. Because I used to be a human rights specialist. I've looked at your makeup, and you can do better. I don't see too many people that look like me in your body. And I know there's students at Dartmouth that you should encourage them to join you in the fantastic mission that you are all about. And with that, I know I've exceeded my time. And thank you for inviting me.
Thank you, Gene. Thanks so much, Gene. And just for the record, the order of speech was by age, so that's why you had to follow Jerry. Jerry Daniel. Charles, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Gene. Good seeing you. When I was asked to be on this panel, about John Sloan Dickey, the first thing I thought of was the fall of 1953, which was our freshman year. And I remember every year there was a convocation, but before the first couple of...
Sorry, they're not hearing.
Can you hear us?
That won't actually help. Actually, okay, well, all right.
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? This is the old-fashioned way of doing it. I don't want to echo, but so within a couple of weeks of arriving in Hanover, there was a way where the president introduced himself to every single freshman. And during that time, the whole thing lasted probably 3 minutes, but it was a very important 3 minutes because I saw two things. One, he signed this document for every freshman, and his signature was the most artistic thing I've ever seen in my life. It was like an exquisite piece of abstract art. That was one thing that struck me. I'm an architect. And then the other thing is at convocation within a couple of days of that, he said to us freshmen, what you just said, Jared, that is, the world's problems are your problems. And I was a kid from Concord, New Hampshire, and I said, what the hell is this all about? But it woke me up. my freshman year, in the fall of 1953. Now, by the time we got as seniors, we were thinking very differently. And that is that our senior year, we never expected to have a required course. And all of a sudden, Great Issues was a required course of every senior. And we thought, what the hell is this all about? Now, within 20 years later, at our 20th reunion, we asked the then President John Kennedy to reinstate the course. And the reason is we thought it was the most valuable course we took while at Dartmouth. It seemed to provide us with knowledge of the world around us. And that was an expression of an awful lot of our class in our 20th reunion. And since then, in every reunion, we keep on harping with the presidents about reinstating general issues. We've given up after Dr. Kim. But that's it. But that's how important we felt that course was for all of us. So what was the course all about that we found so compelling? Very simply, it was the brainchild of President Dickey, as you all know, who felt a Dartmouth graduate should have experienced the lectures and the work of forward-thinking experts in their many fields. These were serious people who were invited by the president to provide a lecture in their chosen subjects. What was John Soane Dickey's legacy? In my opinion, he made us think of issues outside of ourselves as the arts, human relations, politics, national security, individual freedom, religion, humanism, international relations. To put ourselves in the shoes of other people in different nations, cultures, allies, and potential enemies is a valuable lesson, and that's what he taught us. He did this by creating the Great Issues course that was required of all our seniors. He designed the course to include a variety of subjects discussed by great forward-thinking experts in the form of lectures and discussions. The following are examples of these subjects, so you'll understand the complexity of the course. Perspective. He gave the original lecture on the liberal arts and great issues. And there were a couple of other lectures from professors from the government department explaining what the course was all about. But then it got into what was called Problems of Communication in a Democratic Society. And he had Sir William Haley, editor of the Times of London, speak to that subject. Now, the next line was the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November. Now, remember, this was November of 1956, so there was a presidential election going on. So he really understood that it was important for us to understand the reality of presidential elections. And so he had people speak to the conservative and the liberal outlook in a presidential year. Norman Thomas is an incredible man, speaking of presidential elections he had known. And I remember as he took the podium, he immediately asked for a minute of silence for the brave Hungarians during the Hungarian Revolution of 1956. Publication in Democracy by Dean Klepper of Harvard School of Education. The Press in a Democracy with Orville Dreyfus of the New York Times. And I'll never forget the lecture he gave and then the discussion the next morning. He had telephone lines going all the way up to the podium, and there were telephone lines connecting to the editorial board of the New York Times in New York. And what he did is they organized the next day's paper, which would be the Wednesday newspaper, New York Times. And what he was emphasizing was to see the balance between what New York Times would be producing on that Wednesday and the Manchester Union Leader, which is in Manchester, New Hampshire, which is a very, very ultra-conservative newspaper at the time. It was like an anti-communist sheet. But it was interesting for us to see how two newspapers took the same news and what emphasis they gave. So it was really, to me, it was a hell of a lesson. The response, racial desegregation, a challenge in human relations. Now, Thurgood Marshall, which to me was the giant of Civil Rights Act, entitled Desegregation with All Deliberate Speed. I'll never forget, he emphasized that he didn't want a backlash, and he just felt that integration with desegregation with all deliberate speed was very, very important. International relations in a world crisis was another issue. Hugh Gaitskell, the leader of the Parliamentary Labour Party in Great Britain, gave a lecture on Britain and America in a world of crisis. Now, this was the Cold War, where the Russians and the Americans were really at each other's throat constantly. And so there was a tremendous pressure on the world as a result of these two great powers facing each other. The security factor in American foreign policy, forces and factors conditioning American foreign policy, the politics and economics of atomic energy, collective security and outlook for world peace with Hans Morgenthau. Hans Morgenthau was an extraordinary political scientist from the University of Chicago. Crisis in the Middle East, sounds pretty familiar. The outlook in Western Europe with Pennington Hale. One thing that really impressed me about that was he was the first person that none of us had ever heard something of the European Union. And all of a sudden, this gentleman was talking about the possibility of having the two-legged stool, that he called it, between Russia and the United States as these two great powers, as being a little shaky. So why don't we have a European Union where there's a third powerful force to give it the third leg to the stool? And I remember all thinking, Jesus, this is impossible. But it happened years and years later. But in 1957, he talked about it. And then also great issues in the arts. We had Robert Frost, The Nature of Classical Art with Vincent Scully, this brilliant architectural and art critic from Yale. And at that time, he was a very young assistant professor at Yale, and he became this very powerful man of the future. Architecture and planning, examined in the light of accelerating events. Then personal values for modern man, psychiatry, thought control and moral values, a humanistic view of the moral life, science and the human spirit, religious realism and the human predicament. So what I really must say is that the comprehensiveness of the course was just extraordinary. Then the closing lecture was by President Dickey himself, called The Outlook. Now, I can remember a few instances that were pretty impressive to me. Hans Morgenthau, who is this great political scientist from the University of Chicago, I remember him saying that he was emphasizing in his lecture that, that any nation will act only to serve its own interests. And he kept giving examples. And I, being somewhat naive, thought that this was terrible, that nations should act out of sympathy for a given cause. Being of Greek heritage, I knew something of Greek history, so I questioned him. What about the British coming to the aid of Greece in their War of Independence from the Ottoman Empire in 1822? They did this to save Greek heritage. I thought I really had him. His response, the British, young sir, the British entered the war to contain the Ottoman Empire, and the Greek Revolution provided a pretense. So it was clearly in the British's interest to help Greece in that time. Of course, he was correct, and I slunk back to my desk. I'll never forget one other one. A speaker spoke on ethics, the ethical aspect of life. And as soon as he got to the podium, he asked all of us. Now, this was the days where you had a quarter to have a 3-minute phone call. And so he asked all of us, by show of hands, how many of you have come back from a major vacation, Christmas vacation, spring vacation, and call your parents collect? And by doing, the operator has to ask you who you are for the people to accept the charge. And as soon as the parent heard the student's voice, they knew he had arrived safely, and they both hung up. And so he said, and a lot of hands went up. And he continued. He said, all of you are unethical, including your parents. He had laid a clever trap. We really listened to his lecture on ethics very, very, very astutely. I want to thank you for this opportunity to discuss my experiences. What was his legacy? From a very personal point of view, he made me grow as a person and especially to think internationally. I was a Fulbright student in Italy, studying how Italian cities grew over time and how they adapted over time. And I sat on the New England board of the Fulbright for about 20 years. And I think that what you have to remember, when we were students, this country was starting to become an isolationist country again, way back from the 30s. So to open those minds was a very important thing. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. So Melissa, tell us about what it was like to be in the post-Dickey Dartmouth.
Okay, well, thank you, and I'm honored to be on this panel with Professor Danielle and the 57s. So thank you for the opportunity. And I've been thinking a lot about the connections that I have to all of this, and I can tell one more. My Doggy Julian's granddaughter was a bridesmaid at my wedding 34 years ago. So everything circles back to Dartmouth at some point. So my father, Russell Cook, was a class of 1953, and he had this wonderful photograph on the wall while I was growing up of John Sloan Dickey and President Eisenhower, who had been the commencement speaker. Each one of the photographs was individually signed to that person's name, and it's Ike and Dickey at the Dartmouth Grant, and that sort of set the stage for my knowledge and understanding of how important this person was. And still with my father, he was the first person in his family to go to college. He came from a long line of New England Yankees who probably never thought about any other country except the United States. And my father ended up being a worldly person, curious, interested, interesting, and always, all the classes that you've just read through really resonate with how my parents raised us. So the legacy of John Sloan Dickey first came through in that.
Interesting.
Yeah. And I've always been a travel junkie. And so that's, I think, came from my father's international exposure. And my mother had the same thing through her family. And then fast forward to today, the class of 1982 has been working closely with the class of 1957, which is why we're here, to fund an endowment for the Great Issues program. So I've gotten more involved as being part of the advisory board for that. Very happy to see the work continuing. So my post-Dickey Dartmouth education, because of what I've just described in terms of the international orientation of my family, I had the privilege of having a class with Professor Danielle, which was not international. It was about New England town formation and governance. But I took a Soviet history class, and that was my first real experience thinking about a country and a culture that had completely different values from ours and thought about the world in a very different way. I then took 2 African history courses from Professor Leo Spitzer, and those again got me out of my own shell and really thinking about the world in a different way and the impact of colonialism on different parts of the world. And then I went to Spain, language study abroad in Granada, Spain. And it was a fascinating time. This was 1980. Franco had only died about 5 years earlier. And the husband of our professor he fought in the Abraham Lincoln Brigades. And a very quick history of Spain, Madrid was the first city to be bombed from the air. That's where Hitler and Mussolini practiced. And it was really the Republicans against the fascists. I know I'm getting this wrong in terms of the terms, but the point was the United States was really on the wrong side. And the people in the Abraham Lincoln Brigades went in and their passports were stamped not valid for Spain. And they went in and they fought on behalf of the people who were being overrun by Hitler and Mussolini. And it got me really thinking that the United States is not always correct. And that was a huge epiphany for me. I came back, I was taking an American history course that had a lot of international stuff in it. And I remember getting in big arguments with the professor because the assumption was everything the US does is always correct. And it's not the case. And so that's something that's really resonated with me throughout my life. And then finally, when I graduated from Dartmouth, I had to get a job. Didn't have a chance to really go overseas or think internationally until finally I got into a job where I could travel for business. And going into Eastern Europe right after the Berlin Wall came down, spending a lot of time in Asia during the earlier days of China's emergence, and ended up going to Africa as a tourist in 2007 with my husband, and we fell in love with it. I started going back and ended up starting my own business to try to bring investment to the continent. So it's kind of a stream of consciousness from Dad and Eisenhower and Dickey all the way through, and now I've made 50 trips to 16 countries in Africa, And, I like to think I made some difference to some of the people that I've raised money either for their entrepreneurial ventures or for companies that end up employing lots of Africans. So that's what John Sloan Dickey means to me, from the photograph on the wall all the way through to me living in the New York area and British Airways is when people ask me where I live.
Super. Melissa, thank you so much. So I'm mindful of time and don't want to take up too much more of your time because I know we have a lovely reception upstairs. But by way of conclusion, let me offer you a few thoughts about the way in which the Dickey Center seeks to perpetuate the best of the Dickey legacy. And I'm going to pull up some themes that have already been raised by our panelists here. And I want to share with you some guiding principles. The first of these is the need to take ownership of the world's problems. You've heard a few of the paraphrasings of John Sloan Dickey's most famous quote, "The world's troubles are your troubles." The context for that quote was a graduation speech that he was giving in 1948, where he articulated that not just that the world's troubles were your troubles, but that the worst troubles in the world come from men, that we create those troubles. And therefore, it's incumbent upon us morally to try to address those troubles. And hence his line, there's nothing wrong with the world that better human beings cannot fix. That the world's troubles are our troubles because we create them. And so one of the guiding principles of the Dickey Center is to make current Dartmouth students aware of just what those troubles are. What are the world's troubles? And try to instill in them a sense that they have a moral responsibility to, at the very minimum, not perpetuate those troubles, but hopefully to work towards the eradication of those troubles and to be a force for good in the world. The second guiding principle, again, that touches on some of the things that our panelists have talked about, is that the best path for addressing the world's troubles is through the liberal arts, right? So Charles delineated all of the topics that John Sloan Dickey included in his Great Issues lecture, which is a multidisciplinary approach to studying what's going on in the world. John Sloan Dickey himself referred to the liberal arts as the liberating arts, because he truly believed that through the study of the humanities, the sciences, and the social sciences all together, the arts included, that we would instill in people the creativity necessary and give them the many tools needed to address the world's problems. The Dickey Center itself doesn't subscribe to any particular discipline, but tries to introduce students to all the different ways that global happens at Dartmouth, so that they know whether they are a comp lit major, a studio art major, a biology major, government major, they have the ability to shape the world in a positive way. The third lesson from Dickey that we try to instill within the Dickey Center is that we are only as good as the communities we create. John Sloan Dickey told every incoming class at convocation that you are the stuff of the institution. That's right. And what you are, it will be. What we try to do is convene the diverse communities that exist in the world at the Dickey Center, right, to create that kind of community that we want the world to be, right? Because we are the stuff of the world, not just of Dartmouth, but of the world. And what we are will be reflected in the world. Finally, addressing the great issues. Every single one of our speakers has spoken to the insights that they got, the great issues that they were exposed to, whether it was civil rights or the Cold War, the atomic bomb, these kinds of things. It's necessary to address the great issues. Dickey's legacy was that it was the responsibility of higher education to create among the student body a sense of common public purpose. Common public purpose. We talk about the great issues, whether they're in security, health, environment. These are the main pillars of the Dickey Center, because we hope to instill in our community that sense of common public purpose to engage in those particular problems and to address those particular problems. I could go on all day long about all the different ways we do this in our program. One of the most important ways is represented here in this classroom with our Great Issue Scholars who are here from the class of 2025, who are embarking upon a year-long exploration of some of the great issues by exploring those issues through the arts, the humanities, the social sciences, and the sciences, so that as they are crafting their Dartmouth career, they can pursue those fields of most interest to them, while at the same time keeping in mind about how those fields address those great issues, which are part of our common public purpose. I'm going to leave it there. We've come to the end of our time. I'm going to encourage each one of you to ask our panelists questions upstairs in the reception. I want to extend a very deep thank you to Jean Booth, our panelist on the screen, and to all of our panelists here for joining us for this panel on Dickey's legacy. Thank you. Thank you so much.
I'm going to keep you all for a couple more minutes. We have a special announcement from the class of 57 president, Tom Macy, who would like to say a few words.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you, Peter. Class of 57 hereby expresses our deep appreciation to Chris Hardy for her contributions to our class over many years. These contributions are exemplified. These contributions are exemplified by her guidance back in 2012 when we were exploring how best to increase our financial support to the center. She encouraged us to permit flexibility to the Dickey Center staff in developing new and unique programs. Today's panel discussion, as well as previous programs supported by our Class of 1957 Fund for Great Issues Innovations, demonstrate this creative flexibility. We began funding the endowment in 2013 with an initial donation of $50,000 and have continued to build it to its current book value of $575,000, with a market value approaching $900,000. As the class of '82 comes along beside us, the future of innovation in great issues programming seems assured. In our numerous exchanges over the years, Chris has displayed her considerable knowledge of the great issues of the day, her deep understanding of the Dickey Center, its staff and students, and her personal qualities of caring and thoughtfulness. For all this, the class of '57 simply says, thank you, Chris.
Privilege to work with your class and now with the 82s in supporting the mission of the Dickey Center. I'm not a Dartmouth grad, I didn't grow up here, but I have to say I have been so inspired and awed by what the center has been able to do, by its students, and I can't wait to see what the 25s are going to do, by the alumni of the center, by those who knew John Sloan Dickey and his legacy. It truly gives one a sense of purpose to get up and go to work for this organization. I do so with a terrific team of people. Honestly, the Dickey Center staff are the greatest. They make things happen. We're the center of yes. And I can't wait to see where it's going to go next, particularly under the guidance of our brand new Norman E. McCulloch Jr. Director of the Dickey Center, Victoria Holt, who's joined us here today. We could only go up with her guidance. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming.